Hello, I'm Martin Lewis, Senior Lecturer Emeritus at the Department of History at Stanford University, and this is a lecture on the historical geography of betel nut, or betel, Areca palm. It is the eighth lecture in the geocurrent series on the history and geography of natural psychoactive substances. Betel is not very well known in the United States or in Western Europe, but it's a very popular drug. Some 600 million to a billion users. That's actually the fourth most popular psychoactive substance in the world after alcohol, caffeine, and nicotine. It's regionally concentrated in Southeast and especially South Asia, and that's one reason why it doesn't get the attention it probably deserves. It's somewhat similar to tobacco, both in its active component, in its psychological effects, and in its health detriments as well. We'll talk about all of those issues. One interesting thing about betel nut is there are three components needed, at least traditionally, in betel chewing. The active chemical is found in the nut of the Areca palm tree, but it is traditionally wrapped in a leaf. It's actually betel comes from the leaf that it's wrapped in. Piper betel is the scientific name. Interestingly, it's the same genus that has black pepper, world's most popular spice by some measures, or at least it used to be. And also kava or kava, the most important traditional drug of the Pacific, which I'll talk about later. But anyway, the cut nut is wrapped in the betel leaf, and then slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, is added to it to change the chemistry and make the psychoactive component accessible. Interestingly, the same thing is done with coca leaves. Coca is the leaf from which cocaine is derived, and it's chewed with lime as well. And I'll talk about that in the next lecture. One notable thing about prolonged betel is that betel chewing is it stains the teeth and especially the gums. So you can tell a habitual betel chewer. So the betel quid, the nut wrapped in the leaf with a lime, is chewed and then it produces copious amounts of very red saliva, and one spits out the saliva, at least traditionally. This results in quite a bit of opposition on sanitary grounds. So if you're in a region, especially true in Southeast Asia, where people are chewing a lot of betel nut, you'll see the telltale sign on the sidewalk, these splotches of very, very red saliva and dried saliva. So we see signs here, no betel chewing and spitting in various different places. The main active component, arecacholine or arecholine, is very similar to nicotine. Just to quote Wikipedia here, a nicotinic acid-base mild parasympathomimetic stimulant alkaloid. Yes, definitely a stimuloid. It can bring a sense of enhanced alertness and energy along with mild feelings of euphoria and relaxation. The psychoactive effects are comparable to that of nicotine. I wonder if euphoria is really the right word. I mean, is there a thing that we could call mild euphoria? I guess I think of euphoria as something a little bit more intense. And I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia. I've chewed betel on a number of occasions, and I certainly didn't feel any euphoria from it. You know, a mild sense of well-being at best. So it's biochemically grouped with nicotine. I'm not going to go into the details here, but you could see as far as these parasympathomimetic drugs, they mimic the parasympathetic nervous system or stimulate it. And we could see here with plant alkaloids, these two grouped together. As far as the geography and historical geography of betel nut use goes, the map I made is based on another map, which I'll show you in a second. I put a question mark because I'm suspicious about this. It's not showing the use of betel nut today. It's purporting to show it, at least in my map, at the beginning of the early modern era, about in the year 1500. I have, as I do in all of these maps, areas circled in pink, which would be the presumed area of domestication. We're not sure where betel was first used or first turned into a domesticated plant. Philippines is a good bet. That's where the first evidence comes from. And it certainly spread throughout Southeast Asia, then into South Asia. And You can see in this map how it's spread through maritime circuits. This map just shows a narrow band in East Africa, basically along the Swahili coast, and then a narrow band in the Arabian Peninsula, Oman mostly, and a narrow band in coastal China. That may have been accurate at one time, but this map really doesn't reflect current use. The map comes from this article, and I've seen the map many times. I put some question marks on it here, particularly in its western range in East Africa, Madagascar, Oman, parts of Yemen, even Qatar and the UAE, southern Iran. I've spent a little bit of time, perhaps not enough, looking for evidence of contemporary beetle chewing in these areas. And to the extent that it is chewed, it seems to be associated with very recent immigrants from India. It doesn't seem to be indigenously rooted very much, even in Madagascar. Perhaps it was at one time. Drug use comes and goes. Wikipedia has a map that's quite different. I'm suspicious of any kind of map that is going to be based on geopolitical entities, but basically what they're doing is just coloring in countries, the entire country where beetle is chewed. It's showing no beetle chewing in China, in the People's Republic of China, although it certainly shows it in Taiwan. It's accurate for Taiwan. It's not accurate for China. For example, let's look at another map from a different Wikipedia article. Or I should say the map is not from it. I made the map, but I used information from a Wikipedia article on beetle chewing in China. And the article mentions that there are some 100 million Chinese beetle chewers. That's out of 1.3 billion. Staggeringly, 260,000 companies. I mean, most of these would be tiny, tiny firms, evidently. I'm suspicious of the number. But links beetle chewing to three provinces in particular. One is coastal, the island of Hainan, but the other two are in the interior of South China, so it doesn't match those other maps. And also claims that 38% of the population of Hunan are beetle chewers. May or may not be true, but it does seem to have this interior pattern. That doesn't necessarily mean the other map is wrong in regard to earlier time periods, because again, the geographies of these these things change, and it may well be that a beetle has spread relatively recently into the interior. The map doesn't show any in Taiwan, but beetle nut is certainly chewed in Taiwan. If you look at production, you could see a real concentration in India with 700,000 tons. Myanmar, Burma is in second place, but much, much less. Of course, it has a far smaller population. Burma's about 55 million, India 1.3 billion. So on a per capita basis, Myanmar or Burma would have a more extensive production and use. Unfortunate that information is not available for Vietnam or Cambodia, both of which are historically noted for beetle consumption. Malaysia, not so much. Indonesia and Thailand, relatively modest, but still substantial. Note on the bar graph, though, the increase in production. Really rather staggering, particularly for India. You could see essentially about half of global production. And as we'll see later on, beetle chewing has really increased in India, and that's been actually linked to the reduction of cigarette smoking, substitution effect perhaps. If we want to map out beetle growing in India, you see two areas. The far south and the northeast are the areas where it's most widely cultivated. And that is of interest because there are a couple different theories of how beetle entered into South Asia. One is from maritime networks in the south, linked to the south, and the other is overland from the east, which would then be connected to that northeastern production area. It's estimated today that about 30% of Indian men chew beetle, or pan as it's called in Indian, about 7% of Indian women. So many drugs are gendered. in different times and places. It varies, but here's another example. As I mentioned in the previous lecture on tobacco, tobacco use has plummeted in India, and as that's happened, betel chewing has gone up. It's deeply ingrained in Indian medicine, and Ayurvedic medicine was regarded as a mouth freshener and digestive aid, and important for a lot of treatment of illnesses. There are different variants in India. It's usually not chewed in the classical way of simply the betel leaf, the areca palm, and a bit of lime. It's usually, in India at any rate, unlike Southeast Asia and the Pacific, it has other ingredients. Tobacco is often mixed with it, which is interesting when we talk about it replacing replacing tobacco. Sometimes they come together. Even paraffin wax, oddly. What's more popular, at least I believe it's more popular, is what is known as pan masala, or mixed pan again meaning betel. And what pan masala has is a lot of different flavors. And this is something quite typical of India. We saw this with chai, Indian tea, and all the spices that go into it. So here's a brief table on different kinds of betel leaf pan masala, which means in some forms they're leaving out the leaf, which in Southeast Asia is an essential part of it, although it doesn't really have psychoactive components. But you could see, we have a classic mix, and then we have sometimes with mint or menthol, as it says, for a cool kick, or flavors like saffron, chocolate, honey, all different ways of doing it. Let's delve into this a little bit. In northern India, one finds the city of Benares or Varanasi, which is probably the most holy city of Hinduism, right on the Ganges River. A variety of very important religious rituals are practiced there. It's very well noted for its Hindu holy men. A lot of tourists go to Benares as well. And it seems to have developed a particular specialization in pan masala. And so this slide and the next has some varieties from crazy masala foods. So chocolate with coffee sweet pan. I should note that with the real sweet varieties, it's not necessarily a practice to spit it out, as it is with the classic betel nut. But anyway, loved by girls, has the sweetness of sugar and refreshing quality of coffee. Both coffee, obviously, caffeine, and betel nut itself are stimulants, so we get sort of a double dose. And a lot of different flavors here. Simply yummy. Here we have all sorts of new varieties, and to quote from this article from Crazy Masala Food, flavored pan has become popular in India with varieties mirroring the endless flavors of ice cream, including mango, cola, pineapple, strawberry, and chocolate. These are combined with more traditional ingredients such as coconut, aniseed, cardamom, and dried dates. When I gave this lecture in a Stanford Continuing Studies class in the spring of 2024, one of the people in the class is from India. And in this class, we had fairly long discussions afterwards, something I'm sorry to say I can't do in these recorded versions, because it's really, for me anyway, the most interesting part of the class. But his description of these kinds of pan masala is a burst of flavor in your mouth, and attributed its popularity more to the flavor than to the psychoactive ingredient in the betel nut. And it's going upscale in many ways. I mean, here's an article from Fire to Liquid Nitrogen Pan. This shop has more than 300 varieties. And it's a shop in an upscale neighborhood in a West Indian city. As far as the deep history goes, we have very good evidence of betel chewing back at least 4,500 years. It probably dates much earlier than that. So to quote the Wikipedia article here, the oldest unequivocal evidence of betel chewing is from the Philippines, particularly from several individuals buried in a pit on the island of Palawan. dating to 2,680 plus or minus 250 years BC. The dentition of the skeletons is stained red, typical of beetle chewers. And the grave also included shells that were used as containers of lime, one of which still had lime in it. So that's pretty solid evidence. Historians have traditionally linked beetle chewing with speakers of what are known as the Austronesian languages. So these is a family of related languages, one of the most widespread language families in the world, actually. Probably originated in south coastal China or perhaps Taiwan. Taiwan is not on the map, but there are groups of people in eastern Taiwan known as the Taiwanese Aboriginals who are not Chinese, who are considered tribal people who speak, I believe, some 11 different Austronesian languages. But Austronesian speakers, probably from Taiwan or south coastal China, spread over a very large area of the world, essentially the entire Pacific, the island part of Southeast Asia, and beyond. They were likely the first people in the world to master sailing on the high seas. It's very sophisticated navigational techniques, boat design, very watercraft boats. They could take whole sort of colonization teams, men, women, children, pigs, dogs, chickens, seeds, cuttings for plants, and move into both what had been lightly inhabited or uninhabited areas, mostly islands. Yeah, here's a pretty good map showing areas settled by Austronesian people. So you can see it includes Taiwan, sort of the origin point, and then the islands of Southeast Asia, but extending all the way to Madagascar, going westward. Madagascar and New Zealand were the last large or sizable land masses to be inhabited by human beings, and that dates only about 1,000, 1,200 years, really, in both cases, actually a little less in New Zealand. Both Austronesians came to an uninhabited island and brought their ways of life. Later, a lot of people from Africa moved to Madagascar, making it a island of sort of dual cultural heritage. But the languages, all the languages of Madagascar are Austronesian, without a doubt. But there's also this zone of Austronesian influence, where we know Austronesians didn't settle or didn't establish their own populations, but they traded and they brought products and processes. For example, we know they reached the South American coast and they brought sweet potato into the Pacific. There's some scholars who think sweet potato might have just naturally floated there, but most think that no, it was Austronesian connection. And even in California, the Chumash Indians who live in the Santa Barbara area built seafaring boats that were very similar to those of the Austronesians. They were the only people in the coast of the Americas who built these kind of boats. Maybe they discovered it independently. But an interesting thing about this thesis that it was the Austronesians who spread betel is they didn't spread it everywhere. If you go to the Pacific, in parts of Melanesia and parts of Polynesia and Micronesia that were settled by Austronesian peoples, betel was established and is to this day. But you go further into beyond here, what I call the betel line, into places like Tahiti or Hawaii, these Austronesian peoples, the subgroup known as the Polynesians, didn't bring or didn't establish betel. One speculation is that, to quote the Wikipedia, it is believed that betel stopped in the Solomon Islands, which is in Melanesia, due to the replacement of betel chewing with the tradition of kava drinking, prepared from the related species in the genus Piper. Well, it's related to the leaf, not to the nut, and the nut is what has the psychoactive compounds. But kava is very definitely a psychoactive substance. I'll talk about it in a later lecture. I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here with the deep history and history of language groups, partly because I find it a very interesting and important topic. and betel plays in some interesting ways. So how did betel, which was first known from the Philippines, at least archaeologically, strongly associated with Austronesian peoples, but now is mostly cultivated and consumed in India, which was not settled by Austronesian peoples. But Austronesian peoples did visit it and trade with it. So to quote this Wikipedia article, in the Indian subcontinent, betel chewing was introduced through early contact with Austronesian traders from Sumatra, Java, both in Indonesia, today's Indonesia, and the Malay Peninsula, with the Dravidian speakers of Sri Lanka and southern India, that's another language family, at around 3,500 years before present, 1500 BCE. This also coincides with the introduction of Southeast Asian plants like sandalwood and coconut, as well as the adoption of the Austronesian-style outrigger ship and the crab claw sail technology, adopted by the more indigenous Dravidian speakers of South India. Unequivocal literary reference to betel starts only in the Vedic period in medical works in this Ayurvedic medical tradition. And then it reached northern India much later through trade. So that may well be the way it happened. Is one inaccuracy, though, in that article. We now know that coconuts were domesticated in Southeast Asia, but there was another variety in South India, so coconuts were domesticated there as well. And I know this map was taking us out of the world of drugs, but it's very interesting to see the diffusion of coconut domesticated in two separate places and then moved around. You can see the blue line, pre-Columbian introduction across the Pacific. That would have been by Austronesians. And then later we have the Spanish bringing it to Mexico and Arabs bringing it around. So coconut spread. There are some debates, though, because coconuts can float in the sea and can sort of diffuse naturally. At any rate, this old thesis that it was the Austronesians who mastered the sea, who spread their languages from Madagascar to Hawaii, were the people who were responsible for domesticating and popularizing and spreading betel nut. But there's some scholarly disagreement now. So just a quote from this article on the origin of betel chewing, a critical review of past archaeobotanical reports from South India and New Guinea challenges some of the earliest dates claimed for betel chewing. By synthesizing evidence from archaeology, linguistics, and textual analysis on the plants and material culture of betel chewing, a picture emerges that is far more complex than had been previously suggested. Currently, no single model of dispersal, such as the migration of Austronesian, fully explains the transmission. I think that's very well said, and this is happening in many fields of scholarly analysis. So, as scholars learn how to synthesize genetic work on plants, using archaeology, using historical linguistics, you can look at different words for different substances and how those words spread. And when these substances are first mentioned in texts from different regions of the world, you can get a far more comprehensive picture. And as it often happens, it turns out to be far more complicated than initial scholarship suggested. And again, to stay in the weeds of historical linguistics, betel chewing is deeply historically associated with people who speak Austroasiatic languages. Now, that's a different language family. Its main languages, sort of at the national level, would be Vietnamese and Khmer, or Cambodian. But there are many sort of tribal groups who speak Austronesian languages in Southeast Asia, even into India. Austroasiatic languages. These Austroasiatic languages were brought into Southeast Asia from what is now southern China. As the Chinese speakers were expanding south, a lot of other peoples responded to that by moving south themselves out of what is now China into what had been a very sparsely populated non-agricultural peninsula of Southeast Asia. And as they were farmers, they were able to settle in much larger numbers and spread their languages. Later, other peoples moved south, the Thai speakers, the Burmese speakers. They're also from what is now South China, or in the case of the Burmese, into Tibet, but they moved south as well, resulting in a really complex linguistic situation. But this movement of Austroasiatic farmers into Southeast Asia is many, many thousands of years old. Like I say, they were the ones who brought farming into the region. And in Vietnamese and Cambodian culture, betel nut is very deeply ingrained. So let me quote here at some length from a story of a Vietnamese folk tale, the story of the Areca palm tree. Supposedly it's based from around 2000 BCE. Hard to know if that's true. But anyway, to quote again, around 2000 BCE, romantic tragedy involving the love of a young woman with one of twin brothers is said to have transformed the two brothers into the first Areca nut and a limestone. So a palm tree and a limestone. They were subsequently both encircled by the mourning woman, who had turned into a vine of the betel pepper. Upon hearing about these events, the king decreed that forthwith the combination of Areca nut, lime, and betel leaf would be chewed in his kingdom as a symbol of filial and conjugal affection. So it's a very deeply ingrained story. In a way, a crazier story than most of the origination stories of drugs, but it does bespeak something that is historically deep. And again, one last issue of historical linguistics. These Austroasiatic languages extend into India, the Munda languages. These are so-called tribal peoples. They live in upland area. There are actually a couple of different language groups. So they may have brought betel nut to India at a very early period. So, it may have come into India overland in the north and by maritime routes in the south. But it certainly spread, and as I said before, today, India is the main area of betel production and consumption. The Europeans learned about betel as soon as they got to Southeast Asia. At that time, Southeast Asia was the main area of betel growing and consuming. We have an illustration here from an early work on the Philippines, where we can see the betel economy to a certain extent. We see an Areca palm. We see somebody cutting bamboo, but other daily aspects of life. But to quote from Pigafetta, who was one of the first Europeans here, he was on Magellan's voyage and wrote about Magellan's voyage, early 1500s. But speaking of the Philippines, these people are constantly chewing a fruit which they call areca, and which resembles a pear. They cut the fruit in 4 parts, then wrap the leaves of their tree, which they call betra. They mix it with a little lime, and when they have chewed it thoroughly, they spit it out. It makes the mouth exceedingly red. All the people in these parts of the world use it, for it is very cooling to the heart, and if they ceased to use it, they would die. Well, maybe that's what people told them. That does tell you something about the addictive nature, like nicotine. Betel nut is addictive. It's difficult to give up if you are a habitual chewer. And so, maybe you think you would die if you gave it up. Interestingly, in the Philippines, betel chewing pretty much disappeared under Spanish influence and missionary influence. Some of the tribal peoples of northern Luzon chew it extensively, not all of them. Something I talked about briefly in the introductory lecture. Just like with snuff boxes in Europe, betel boxes in traditional Southeast Asian societies were often highly elaborate and were symbols of status. If you were of high status, you could afford to have them, and you can see on the left, these are carry-on betel boxes used by men hooked into the belt. So it would be a bodily ornament, and not just a container that could indicate your level of wealth, sophistication, and status. Throughout Southeast Asia, you have cultural sayings, aphorisms that really show the importance of betel historically. So in Malaysia, where betel chewing is much diminished under the influence of Islam, but anyway, this old aphorism, betel opens the door to the home and betel opens the door to the heart. Or in Burma, where traditional offerings to monks and elders included betel, tobacco, and tea. I find that really interesting because betel, tobacco, and tea are all psychoactive substances. They're all stimulants. Burmese monks are supposed to be very abstemious in terms of not eating meat, not drinking alcohol, but natural stimulants are just fine. And in Vietnamese, going back to that legend that I recounted, anyway, the phrase matters of betel and areca, meaning the betel leaf and the areca nut palm, were historically synonymous with discussions of marriage. So, really deep. Let's move on to talk a little bit about betel chewing and health. And I have to say the evidence is that it's mostly negative. Here is, I have some illustrations here. One's claiming it's the world's most addictive nut. Well, I suppose you could say cola nuts, which are caffeine laden, are also addictive. Caffeine is addictive, but I don't think any other nuts are addictive, certainly in a drug sense. But another, the dangers of betel quid chewing or the dangers of chewing pan. Yeah, there's a lot of warnings. Like I say, in India, pan chewing has really increased, and that has a lot of health experts concerned. Now, there are some sources that claim that betel has benefits. I've mentioned before, there are some sources that claim that tobacco has benefits and may have benefits in certain circumstances, even though overall it's very harmful. But anyway, this article that I cite here, claims that it boosts the appetite. Well, that's interesting because usually stimulants reduce appetite. Increase energy level. Yes, stimulants do that. Detoxify the body. Well, that comes from traditional Indian Ayurvedic medicine. I don't think there's any scientific evidence. Helps fight against internal parasites. Intriguing. I'd like to see more research on that. Aids in stroke recovery. Manages schizophrenia. Seems highly unlikely, but there are some scientific work using betel for mental disorders like schizophrenia. I have no idea what balances the blood means. That seems to indicate a sort of a pre-scientific understanding of medicine, but I'm not so sure. Helps with mood and anxiety. Well, that could be true. But it's interesting, the same author in the same article it admits there are some negative side effects like higher risk of cancer, asthma, addiction, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, seizures, urinary tract obstruction, oral and dental health. Overall, it seems like this article, which starts by talking about the benefits, includes more detriments. And yeah, they're pretty clear. So here's from an article, interestingly titled The Seeds of Ignorance, Consequences of a Booming Betel Nut Economy, from just a few years back. Notes it is an oral carcinogen, so associated with cancer of in the mouth, promotes non-malignant tooth and gum disease, which is interesting because traditionally it was often said to be beneficial for teeth and gum. And adverse pregnancy outcomes. In Papua New Guinea, where roughly half the population, half the people chew betel nut, has the world's highest incidence of oral cancer, and it's jumped in recent years, and betel consumption has increased there as well. I suppose I can conclude by saying that it's inadequately studied and understood. To quote from an article from Addiction Biology on betel quid, New Insights into an Ancient Addiction, it's a complex natural product. That's true, it has many different alkaloids, making it difficult to identify specific components, multiple psychoactive agents. Our data suggests that toxic elements of high molecular weight contribute to the oral health liability, while two distinct low molecular weight components may provide elements of reward. And the nicotinic activity of arecocholine contributes to the physical dependence of addiction. My take-home message is research has been inadequate and is just starting to figure out the complex chemistry and physiological reactions to those chemicals in the body. So yeah, more research is needed. And like I said, it has been suggested that it can be useful for treating psychosis. Here's an article from the American Journal of Psychiatry saying the study tested the findings of a prior study indicating a therapeutic relationship between consumption of betel nut and symptoms of schizophrenia. Result: male high-consumption betel chewers had significantly milder symptoms than low-consumption chewers. So that evidently are people with schizophrenia, and those who chew a lot of it have milder symptoms. Interesting. Again, I'd like to see follow-up work on this. I think it's too soon to say what the effects are, and that's true for many drugs. There's kind of a resurgence or renaissance of using psychoactive substances, particularly psychedelic substances, to treat mental disorders. Quite controversial. I'll talk a lot about that in a subsequent lecture. Finally, to conclude this relatively brief lecture on betel, I mostly have questions here. Now, why did betel fail to globalize? So unlike coffee, tea, and tobacco, which in the early modern period, 1500s, 1600s, into the 1700s, just explosively spread across the world. And betel was well ensconced in Southeast Asia and into South Asia, India, and it certainly did spread in India. I mean, it was known earlier, but it's fairly recent that it's really taken off and become so popular. So why this difference? Well, one thing may just be a sort of resistance to chewed psychoactive substances. It's interesting that coca, from which cocaine is derived, the subject of the next lecture, did not globalize. Cocaine, its active main alkaloid, did, but coca itself didn't. Even though for a while it was cultivated extensively in Indonesia, it disappeared from Indonesia. It's somewhat more difficult to export leaves for chewing, although tea is leaves which were exported. Although we saw with things like the Clipper ship, they deteriorate over time. Some of these leaves deteriorate much more quickly. Khat, we'll talk about that in another lecture, is the main natural stimulant used in the Horn of Africa and into Yemen, a problematic drug. Cola, nut from West Africa with high levels of caffeine. All of them are chewed and none of them globalized. With khat, it's difficult to keep the leaves fresh enough. I'll talk about that. Cola extracts were used in Coca-Cola and the like, and still are used, but just in a very minor way, just to give it a caffeine boost, as far as I know. So this resistance to chewing, well, it's much, in a way, easier to drink tea or coffee than to chew a big wad of leaves or a nut wrapped up in a leaf with lime in it. That may have something to do with it. Can be not necessarily the best taste either. Although it's interesting, in India, they've overcome this by adding a plethora of flavors, sweetness, and the like, which says something quite distinctive about Indian culture. Maybe with betel also a resistance to the stained teeth and gums. In a betel chewing culture, people don't think anything of it, but people from outside of betel chewing culture see the stained teeth and gums and find it very distasteful. Then there's the issue, as like I said, with competition with other drugs, where it may have ceased to spread in the Pacific because of kava. But kava is a very different drug. It's not a stimulant. It's in some ways it's closer to alcohol and its effects. It's complicated. Competition with tobacco. Although the interesting thing with India now is people in India have decreased tobacco use. Betel has gone up. Sometimes tobacco is mixed in with pan. One must realize that. Anyway, overall, like I say, its closest analog would be nicotine and tobacco. They're complex stimulants. They're addictive. They cause some physical harm. It seems like betel chewing, though, is less harmful than cigarettes, maybe more comparable to chewing tobacco itself, associated with oral cancers and other things. But the lung cancer risk of cigarettes is far greater than the oral cancer risk from chewing tobacco or from chewing betel. So anyway, betel is a very distinctive and interesting substance. It opens windows on prehistory, on movements of peoples and movements of crops and technologies around the world. One reason why I find it particularly interesting. The next lecture, we'll move on to consider coca leaves, and I'll also talk about cocaine, which is the main alkaloid active component found in coca leaves. So it's a sort of different story where the coca leaves failed to globalize, but cocaine extracted from them did so very rapidly in the late 19th century, and with a lot of social and health damage coincident with that. So that will be the next talk in the Geocurrent series on the historical geography of natural mind-altering substances. Thank you for listening.